Have you ever watched a drama where the main character gets handed a superpower that sounds like a cheat code, and then you slowly realize it's basically a curse wearing a nice suit? Because that's the vibe I get from Countdown King. It's one of those rise from nothing stories that should feel like pure wish fulfillment, and somehow it keeps twisting that wish until you're sitting there like, wait, do I even want him to win anymore? What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Bongo Gaming. And yeah, I know the channel name makes it sound like I should be reviewing loot boxes and frame rates, but you and I both know we live here for long-form drama spirals too. If you enjoy these deep dive breakdowns, feel free to subscribe to Bongo Gaming so you don't miss the next one. I'm keeping spoilers at a moderate level today, meaning I'll talk about the setup and some mid-story turns that feel kind of essential to the experience, but I'm going to stay vague about the biggest late-game swings and how everything ultimately lands. So, Countdown King. The premise is immediately sticky. Zion Reed is a broke delivery driver in Los Angeles. After a crash, he wakes up with a supernatural vision that lets him see lifespans, hidden values, and future fortunes. And from that one change, the entire series becomes this long question: what happens when a person who's been ignored by the system suddenly gains a way to read the system like it's printed in the air? Not just people's time left on Earth, which is already heavy, but the secret numbers behind the numbers. The kind of knowledge that makes you dangerous in a city that runs on deals, desperation, and dreams. And here's where it gets interesting: a lesser show would treat that power like a gimmick. A cool visual effect, a few clever scenes, then we move on. But the whole point of Countdown King is that the power isn't just a trick. It's an engine. It's a moral accelerant. It's a lens that turns every conversation into a transaction whether Zion wants it or not. I want to start with the emotional temperature of the beginning, because the opening stretch matters a lot for whether you buy into Zion as a protagonist. This is not a character who starts out charming in the traditional TV lead way. He's not introduced as some perfect underdog with a heart of gold and a quirky friend group. He's introduced as tired. The kind of tired you can't sleep off. The kind that lives in your shoulders. And I really respond to that, because it immediately frames his hunger as less about greed and more about survival, at least at first. There's a specific kind of scene this premise almost demands early on, and Countdown King leans into it in a way that feels both cinematic and mean. Zion realizes he can see something hovering over people, like a countdown that only he can read. It's not presented like a superhero moment. It's presented like vertigo. Like the world is suddenly too loud and too full of information. Imagine the camera staying a little too close to his face, letting you catch the flicker of panic before he forces his expression back into something neutral because he's in public, and men like him don't get to be fragile in public. The editing rhythm gets sharp, quick glances, a flash of a number, a blink, another number. And you can almost feel his brain trying to do the math of it, trying to decide if he's hallucinating or if the universe just changed the rules on him. Then the show adds the other layer, the one that makes it a power fantasy. It's not only, how long does this person have left, it's, what is this moment worth, what is this person hiding, what is this choice going to pay out? The first time a drama tells you its lead can see the future fortunes of people around him, you're trained to think, okay, we're going to casinos, stock trades, lottery tickets, all the obvious stuff. Countdown King does flirt with that energy, but it also makes you sit with the ugliness of it. Because if you can see someone's fortune, you can also see when someone's about to lose everything. And if you're Zion Reed, broke and invisible, you're going to be tempted to treat other people's downfalls as your ladder. Let me pause on Los Angeles as a setting, because I think the city is basically a character here, at least conceptually. This isn't the LA of sunshine and montage. It's the LA of headlights and long nights. The LA where everyone is selling a version of themselves, including the people who swear they're above that. A story about hidden values and fortunes could happen anywhere, sure, but LA makes it feel like the show is putting capitalism under a microscope and then turning the heat up. Even the idea of value becomes slippery. Is Zion seeing people's value to the market? Their value to someone else? Their value to themselves? The best version of this kind of writing doesn't answer that cleanly, because the discomfort is the point. The part that really hooked me, though, isn't the concept. It's the implied character spiral. Zion rising from nothing to the most powerful man in Los Angeles is a big swing. It's almost mythic. It's the kind of logline that could turn into something cartoonish if the writers aren't careful. But there's an opportunity in that rise, because power doesn't just change what you can do. It changes what you think you're allowed to do. It changes your posture. It changes what you forgive in yourself. And I'm going to be real with you, I love stories that force a protagonist to sit in that uncomfortable in-between space where you understand them and you're also terrified of them. I don't need my main character to be good. I need them to be honest. Or at least honestly written. Now, since this is a 2026 series and I'm not going to pretend I can cite specific episode-by-episode beats like I have a spreadsheet open, I'm going to stay grounded in what the premise promises and what the mid-story evolution typically looks like when a show commits to this kind of arc. The way Countdown King reads, it's structured like a staircase. The early steps are small. Zion uses the vision to solve immediate problems. Rent, debt, food. The humiliations that come with being broke in a city that charges you money just to exist. Those early wins are important because they justify the later moral compromises. If the show starts with him doing something massive and unforgivable, you lose that gradual slide. But if the show starts with him making choices that feel reasonable, the audience comes with him. And that's where the danger lives. Just when you think it's going to settle into a predictable rhythm of Zion cheats the system and gets richer, the lifespan part of the power adds an entirely different genre under the surface. Because seeing lifespans is not fun. It's not a cool hacking tool. It's grief in advance. It's anxiety with numbers attached. This is where the performances matter, even in the abstract. A premise like this can be played two ways. 1. The actor plays Zion as a slick genius, already 3 steps ahead, barely emotionally affected. That can be entertaining, but it turns the show into a cold heist. 2. The actor plays Zion as a guy whose nervous system is constantly overloaded. He's making decisions fast because if he slows down, he'll feel the weight of what he's seeing. That second approach is the one that makes the story human, and it's the one I hope the show leans into, because it turns every victory into something a little haunted. And the haunting doesn't have to be supernatural. It can be social. Imagine being in a room with people who have always had power. Investors, gatekeepers, people whose casual conversations decide whether you eat. Zion walks in with cheap shoes and a tired face, and his entire life he's been trained to lower his eyes. Then suddenly he can see something in them they can't see in themselves. Not just their future fortunes, but the hidden value they pretend they don't care about. That flips the power dynamic, but it doesn't erase the threat. If anything, it makes it worse, because now Zion has something to lose. That's one of the smartest thematic ideas baked into this premise. The climb itself becomes a trap. The moment Zion starts winning, he's no longer allowed to be just a guy trying to survive. The world starts watching him. People start attaching themselves to him. And you don't get to be powerful in a city like LA without becoming useful to someone. There's also a question this show inevitably raises, and I love when dramas don't rush past it. If you can see someone's lifespan, do you owe them anything? If you know a stranger has days left, do you intervene? Do you warn them? Do you keep walking because you can't carry everyone? And if you can see hidden values, do you start treating people like walking stock portfolios? Like their worth is a number floating above their heads? Because here's the cruel trick. Zion starts this story broke. That means he's been treated like a number his whole life. Delivery driver. Replaceable. One bad month away from disaster. When he gains the vision, it's almost like the universe gives him the same weapon the system has been using against him. It's the ability to quantify. To reduce. To decide who matters in a way that looks objective, because it's numerical. That's not just a superpower. That's a commentary, if the writers are paying attention. And I want to linger on the hidden values part, because I think that's where the show can either become brilliant or become messy. Hidden values can mean money, sure. But it can also mean hidden motives, hidden trauma, hidden leverage, hidden love. It's such a broad phrase that it gives the writers room to make the power feel poetic instead of purely mechanical. Like, maybe Zion starts noticing that the people with the highest value aren't always the richest. Maybe value changes depending on who is looking. Maybe Zion's gift isn't showing truth, it's showing a truth filtered through his hunger. If the drama plays it that way, then the vision becomes unreliable in the most interesting sense. Not unreliable like, it randomly doesn't work, but unreliable because Zion is the one interpreting it. And interpretation is where morality lives. Let me throw in a contrarian take right here, because I know how this type of show usually gets discussed online. A lot of people tend to demand that a story like this either condemns Zion constantly or makes him an aspirational antihero who never really has to pay for anything. I actually think the more uncomfortable middle is the best place for Countdown King to sit. I don't want the show to morally babysit me every time Zion makes a questionable choice. Sometimes I want the writing to let me feel the seduction of it. Let me feel why he does it. Not because I endorse it, but because I understand how a person gets there. And before anyone misreads that, no, I'm not saying crime is cool, or exploiting people is fine. I'm saying a drama that's about power should be powerful enough to tempt you. Otherwise it's just preaching. Another thing I keep thinking about is how the show likely uses its visuals to represent this gift. Because seeing lifespans and fortunes could be done with clunky on-screen graphics that feel like a video game HUD, and that can work if the tone is playful. But Countdown King, from its premise, feels like it wants to be more grounded, more sweaty, more street level at first. If I were staging it, I'd want the numbers to feel invasive. Like they're not floating neatly above someone's head, they are bleeding into the frame. Reflections in glass. Flickers in neon signage. A countdown that appears in a puddle when Zion looks down. Something that keeps the supernatural element textured, not polished. And editing plays a huge role there too. This kind of ability can easily become repetitive. He looks at someone, sees a number, reacts. You can only do that so many times before it becomes a gimmick. The way you keep it alive is you change the rhythm. Sometimes you show the number fast, almost subliminal, and focus on Zion's face. Sometimes you don't show it at all and you let the audience infer what he's seeing based on how his expression hardens. Sometimes you use sound instead of visuals, like a faint ticking under the dialogue that only kicks in when Zion locks onto someone. Sound design is honestly where I think this series could quietly flex. A lifespan vision can have a sonic identity. A low hum when someone's near their end. A distorted, muffled ambience when Zion's overwhelmed. Or even the opposite, a sharp silence, like the world drops out for a second when he sees something he can't unsee. If the show uses silence well, it could make those moments feel like getting punched in the chest. And if it doesn't? If it leans too hard on loud, obvious stings every time he sees a number? That's when the power starts to feel like a jump scare machine instead of a psychological weight. That's the line you walk with supernatural dramas that are trying to be prestige-coded. Here's a question that kept popping into my head as I sat with this premise. What does most powerful man in Los Angeles actually mean in this story? Because power can be money. It can be political influence. It can be fear. It can be information. With Zion's gift, information feels like the core. He becomes powerful because he knows what you don't know about yourself. That's terrifying. That's intimate. That's a form of control that doesn't require a gun, even if the story eventually drifts into more overtly dangerous territory. And that brings me to relationships, because a show like this lives or dies on whether Zion's personal connections feel real as the plot escalates. The richest dramas about power aren't just about the external climb. They're about the internal rot. Zion's gift changes how he sees people. That's going to alter every relationship he has. Friends start to feel like liabilities. Romantic intimacy becomes complicated because how do you look at someone you love if you can see their countdown? How do you not flinch? How do you not start doing math in the middle of a kiss? The part that scares me, in a good way, is how quickly that could turn into emotional isolation. The show has this built-in loneliness mechanic. Zion can't really talk about what he sees without sounding insane or manipulative. And even if he confesses to someone, what do they do with that? Imagine being told, "I can see how long you have left." That's not a cute secret. That's a burden you're handing someone. So if Countdown King is smart, it doesn't just make Zion powerful. It makes him alone at the top, and it makes that loneliness feel earned, not melodramatic. I'm going to admit something kind of personal about my viewing habits with shows like this. I'm the type of person who gets weirdly attached to the early Zion version of a character. The guy's still wearing the same jacket, still counting coins, still trying to be decent while the world keeps demanding he be ruthless. And when the glow-up happens, when the suits get tailored and the apartment gets nicer and the camera starts shooting him from lower angles like he's a monument, a part of me always mourns the smaller, softer version. It's not even rational. It's just, I like the human scale. And stories like this intentionally take that away from you. They make you grieve the protagonist while he's still alive. But that's also why it works. The show is basically asking, how much of yourself are you willing to trade for security? And the cruel answer is, you don't know until you're starving. Another rehook, because we're not even at the juiciest dilemma yet, the moment Zion realizes he can see fortunes isn't the moment he becomes dangerous. The moment he realizes he can change those fortunes is where the story starts to bite. Think about it. Seeing is one thing. Intervening is another. If the show lets Zion nudge outcomes, exploit timing, position himself like a chess player, then every win becomes ethically loud. You're not just watching him get lucky. You're watching him choose who loses. And that's where a lot of dramas either go cowardly or go thoughtful. The cowardly version pretends everyone Zion steps on deserved it, so the audience doesn't have to feel bad. The thoughtful version shows you collateral damage. Not in a preachy way, but in a way that makes the city feel populated by real lives. It's easy to root for a rise when the people below are faceless. It's harder when the show gives them faces. Now, because I can't responsibly pretend I know all the specific supporting characters the series introduces, I'm going to talk about them in terms of roles, because you can almost feel the archetypes this premise attracts. There's usually a mentor figure, someone who recognizes Zion's potential before the world does. Sometimes it's a business person, sometimes it's someone more criminal, sometimes it's a mixture where you can't tell if the mentorship is genuine or just opportunistic. There's usually an antagonist who represents old power, the kind of person who's offended not because Zion is evil, but because Zion is out of place. And then there's usually someone from Zion's old life, a grounding relationship that becomes strained as he rises. Those are the emotional stakes. That's where the show stops being about money and becomes about identity. If Countdown King is firing on all cylinders, it makes those roles messy instead of clean. It makes the mentor both helpful and predatory. It makes the antagonist charming enough that you understand why people follow them. It makes the grounding relationship complicated enough that you can't just blame Zion for everything that breaks. Because in real life, people grow apart for reasons that aren't cinematic. They grow apart because their fears don't match anymore. I also want to talk about pacing, because a rise to power story has a very specific risk: either it moves too fast and feels unearned, or it moves too slow and feels like it's stalling. The sweet spot is when each step up costs something emotionally. You don't just get a better car. You lose trust. You lose sleep. You lose the ability to enjoy a quiet meal without scanning the room for numbers. And if the show is really daring, it doesn't just escalate external stakes. It escalates internal stakes. Zion starts the series thinking the goal is to be safe. Then the goal becomes to be free. Then the goal becomes to be untouchable. And untouchable is where people start doing monstrous things, because they convince themselves it's the only way to stay alive in a world that punishes vulnerability. This is where I want to highlight something I appreciate in dramas that deal with supernatural powers. The best ones treat the power as a metaphor that evolves. At first, Zion's vision is about opportunity. Later, it becomes about paranoia. Because once you've seen what's hidden in other people, you start assuming everyone is hiding something. Even the people who love you. Even the people who saved you. The show's title, Countdown King, is so loaded in that regard. A countdown implies inevitability. It implies time running out. It implies pressure. And calling him a king implies control. So the title itself is already a contradiction. Is Zion in control, or is he just watching the numbers tick down while he pretends he's steering? There's a visual motif I'd expect a series like this to play with, and it's the way time shows up in spaces. Clocks in the background. Traffic lights. Microwave timers. Digital billboards. All the little countdowns that already exist in city life, now turned into reminders of mortality and money. If the cinematography is thoughtful, it can make LA feel like it's constantly counting down even when Zion isn't looking. And I know I'm nerding out about filmmaking choices, but that's because this premise demands craft to keep it from feeling like a comic book pitch stretched into hours. The camera has to communicate what Zion sees without turning every scene into exposition. The actors have to communicate what Zion feels without him constantly saying, "I can see your lifespan," which would get old immediately. And the writing has to find new ways to stress test the power. One of my favorite things in stories like this is when the power backfires in a way that isn't literal. Not like, his vision stops working. More like, it works perfectly, and that's the tragedy. He sees something he wishes he didn't. He learns a truth that ruins a relationship. He makes a choice based on numbers and later realizes the numbers didn't measure the thing that mattered. That kind of backfire is so much more haunting because it's not a punishment from the universe. It's a consequence of treating life like a spreadsheet. Here's where I'm going to get a little self-aware for a second. Whenever a show gives a character the ability to see people's value, I always think, okay, great, now the fandom is going to start ranking characters like they are stocks. And you just know the discourse is going to be unhinged. People will be like, actually, Zion is justified because the market, and I'm going to be sitting there at 3 a.m., 5 episodes deep, whispering to myself, please, let us feel things again. But that's also kind of the point of the show, isn't it? It dares you to quantify people, then it judges you for it. Anyway, back to Zion. The rise to power arc in a drama like this usually has a midpoint where the protagonist crosses a line and the show makes you sit with it. Not a cartoonish villain moment. A quiet line. A choice that feels small in the moment but changes who they are. Zion might start by using his gift to avoid harm. But midway through, the calculus shifts. He starts using it to gain leverage. And leverage is a drug. Because leverage means you don't have to ask. You don't have to beg. You don't have to hope someone takes pity on you. You can make the world move. But power also attracts predators, and this is where the supporting cast becomes essential. You need characters who see Zion as a tool. Characters who see his gift as a resource to extract. And Zion, being who he is, being someone who's been exploited his whole life, is both allergic to exploitation and dangerously good at rationalizing it when he's the one doing it. That contradiction is where the best scenes would live. There's also something inherently tragic about seeing lifespans in a city obsessed with youth and reinvention. In LA, people reinvent themselves every day. New name, new look, new hustle. Zion's gift cuts through that. It says, no matter what mask you wear, time is still ticking. That's terrifying in a place built on denial. So if the show is sharp, it uses LA's obsession with image as a counterpoint to Zion's forced intimacy with reality. And can we talk about how this power would mess with Zion's sense of empathy? Because empathy requires you to treat people as people, not outcomes. If Zion starts associating people with numbers, he might stop listening to what they say and start listening to what their future fortune implies. He might stop hearing pain and start hearing opportunity. But the show could also do the opposite, and that's what I'd love. It could make Zion more empathetic in a twisted way. If you can see someone's lifespan is short, you might start being kinder. You might start giving grace. You might start seeing everyone as fragile. And that's where the drama can really hurt you emotionally, because you realize Zion's gift could have made him a healer, not a king. The fact that he becomes powerful instead is a choice, even if it's an understandable one. The next layer, and this is where the series can get genuinely thorny, is fate versus free will. If Sion sees a fortune, is it set? If he sees a lifespan, is it fixed? Or does his knowledge change it? The show can play that in a bunch of directions. It can be deterministic, which makes it bleak. Or it can be chaotic, which makes it tense. Or it can be conditional, where the vision shows probabilities rather than certainties, which makes Sion's obsession even more dangerous because he starts thinking he can optimize life. And if the show does the probability thing, then Sion becomes less like a magician and more like an addict. He's chasing the best outcome, constantly tweaking, constantly calculating, never resting. That's a very modern kind of tragedy. It's basically the wellness optimization mindset turned into a supernatural crime drama. I can feel some of you asking, okay, but is it actually entertaining, or is it just heavy? And this is where I think Countdown King can be both, because the premise naturally creates suspense in everyday scenes. A simple conversation becomes a minefield if Sion can see hidden values. A handshake becomes a threat. A smile becomes a mask. You can shoot a boardroom scene like an action sequence if the audience understands Sion is reading numbers the way someone else would read body language. And if the actor playing Sion has the chops, you can do entire stretches where he barely speaks and the tension still climbs. Just micro expressions. A flicker in his eyes when he sees a number that doesn't make sense. The way his jaw tightens when someone lies. The way he laughs a beat too late because he's processing the calculation behind the person in front of him. That kind of performance is hard. It's subtle work. And it's the kind of thing viewers sometimes don't consciously notice, but they feel it. They feel when an actor is doing math behind their eyes. But let's not pretend there aren't pitfalls. A show like this can easily get lost in its own escalation. Once Sion starts gaining influence, the plot can balloon. Bigger deals, bigger enemies, bigger stakes. And if the writers aren't careful, you lose the intimate horror of the gift. It becomes about who will win the power struggle, and the lifespans become set dressing. So the question I keep coming back to is, does Countdown King stay emotionally grounded as it climbs? Does it remember the delivery driver, even when he's sitting in rooms he never dreamed of entering? Because the reason people love these stories isn't just seeing someone win. It's seeing what winning costs. And there's another sneaky hook in the premise: Sion isn't just reading other people. He's going to start wondering what his own number is. If he can see lifespans, can he see his own? And if he can't, why not? Is he blind to himself the way we're all blind to ourselves? Or is the universe protecting him from knowledge that would break him? Either answer is narratively juicy, because it turns the power inward. It forces Sion to confront the one thing he can't out-hustle. I'll tell you the moment I think a lot of viewers either fully lock into this show or bounce off it. It's when Sion stops being reactive and starts being strategic. When the series shifts from, this happened to him, to, he is doing this. That's when you stop watching an underdog story and start watching a king-making story. And king-making stories are always about violence. Sometimes physical, sometimes emotional, sometimes structural. But always violence. The show's midsection, conceptually, is where Sion's choices should get sharper. He's no longer just using the gift to avoid eviction. He's using it to select people. To decide who gets access to him. To decide who is useful. And that selection process is where the drama can get genuinely uncomfortable, because it mirrors real-world gatekeeping in a way that's almost too on the nose. Sion becomes the very thing that once kept him out. Now, I don't want to paint him as a monster, because I think that's boring. The best version of Sion is someone who still has flashes of conscience. Someone who still remembers what it felt like to be powerless. The tragedy isn't that he becomes evil overnight. The tragedy is that he becomes efficient. He starts cutting out unnecessary feelings because feelings slow you down. And then one day he realizes the feelings were the point. Here's another thing I'd love the show to explore: the difference between value and worth. Value is what the world assigns you. Worth is what you are. If Zion can see hidden values, the show can force him to confront how often value is a lie people agree to. It's branding. It's networking. It's optics. And Zion, coming from nothing, might be the one person who can't fully buy into those lies because he knows what hunger feels like. Or he might buy into it harder than anyone because he's desperate to never feel hunger again. Either way, it makes for a compelling character study. I'm going to circle back to Craft for a second, because I think Countdown King's success would depend on how it shoots faces. A drama about reading people has to be obsessed with faces. The camera has to linger. It has to let us see the cracks. If the directing style is too flashy, too cut-heavy, too eager to move on, you lose the psychological tension. But if it's patient, if it lets a stare hang too long, if it lets a smile curdle, then the show becomes hypnotic. And the color palette matters too. I'd expect a gradual shift. Early episodes might feel more washed, more harshly lit, more fluorescent realism. As Zion gains power, the world might get richer, warmer, more saturated. And that's not just aesthetic. That's thematic. It's the show seducing you alongside him. It's saying, look how good it feels to be on top. Look how pretty the night is when you can afford it. But then the smart move is to bring back the ugliness when it counts. To show that underneath the rich colors, the same darkness is still there. Maybe even deeper now. Another rehook, because the most dangerous part of this whole premise isn't the money, or the lifespans, or the power. It's the moment Zion starts believing the numbers more than he believes people. Once that happens, every relationship becomes a negotiation. Every apology becomes a tactic. Every act of kindness becomes suspect, because is it kindness, or is it investment? And that's where the drama can break your heart if it wants to. One more angle I want to touch on is how the show might handle future fortunes, without turning into pure determinism. If Zion sees someone's fortune and then treats them accordingly, he might create the outcome he saw. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy loop. And those loops are catnip for drama writers, because they let you explore how much of fate is actually just people reacting to information. Even in real life, we do that. We hear a rumor, we act differently, and suddenly the rumor becomes true. If Countdown King leans into that, then Zion's gift becomes less like a window into destiny and more like a mirror reflecting his own biases. He sees, this person will be rich, so he treats them like a winner, gives them access, opens doors, and then they become rich. He sees, this person is doomed, so he avoids them, denies them help, and then they become doomed. That's not supernatural fate. That's social power. And if the show is brave, it lets Zion notice that. It lets him realize he's not just reading the world. He's writing it. That's also where the drama can sneak in social commentary without feeling like it's stopping the story to lecture. Because Hidden Values is basically an allegory for how society assigns worth. Zion can see the algorithm of life. He can see what the world will reward. And the question becomes, does he accept that algorithm, or does he fight it? And if he fights it, does he lose everything he's built? I can already feel the potential tension in scenes where Zion is faced with someone whose lifespan is short, someone who needs help right now, and the numbers tell him there's no return. No future fortune. No hidden value. Just a human being. That's the kind of test that reveals who he's become. And I'm not saying the show has to make him pass that test. Sometimes the whole point is that he fails, and we watch him live with it. There's also something inherently dramatic about a protagonist who can see the end. Whether it's the end of a life, the end of a relationship, or the end of his own luck. Because once you can see endings, you start trying to outrun them. And you can't outrun time. You can only distract yourself with power. If the series is paced well, that sense of time pressure should creep in gradually. Not as a constant gimmick, but as a growing hum under everything. Even the quiet scenes. Even the scenes where Zion is winning. Especially those. Because the audience will be sitting there thinking, okay, but what's the cost? What's ticking down behind his smile? I want to go back to Zion as a delivery driver for one more second, because that job choice in the premise is not accidental. Delivery work is literally about time. Timers. Routes. Deadlines. Being judged by speed. Being treated like a moving part. So giving that character a power that makes time visible feels poetic in a grim way. It's like the universe takes the thing that has always controlled him and hands him a version of it as a weapon. And then the show asks whether he becomes the controller, or whether the weapon controls him. There's a lot of room here for recurring motifs in the music too. A simple rhythmic tick that evolves into a heavier beat as Zion gains power. A theme that starts fragile and becomes triumphant, then gets corrupted with dissonance as the choices get darker. Those are the kinds of musical decisions that can make a drama feel cohesive even when the plot sprawls. And okay, I'll admit it, I'm a sucker for a good corrupted triumph motif. Give me a theme that makes me feel proud of the character and sick at the same time, and I'm locked in. One thing I'd watch out for, though, is how the show handles exposition. A power like this needs rules, but the more you explain, the less mystical it feels. The best dramas give you just enough to understand the stakes and then they let you live in the ambiguity. They let you wonder if Zion is interpreting the numbers correctly. They let you question whether hidden value is a moral category or a financial one. They let the audience do some of the work. Because if a character sits down and explains the entire power system in a neat monologue, it drains the tension. It turns mystery into mechanics. And Countdown King, at least conceptually, feels like it should be more dread than mechanics. And the dread isn't only about death. It's about becoming the kind of person who stops caring. There's another contrarian angle I want to offer, because I can already imagine the criticism that would come up if this series leans into Zion's climb hard. People might say it glamorizes exploitation or celebrates a ruthless mindset. I actually think a show can depict glamour without endorsing it, as long as it also depicts aftermath. As long as it shows you the empty room after the party. The moment when Zion is alone and the numbers are still there, floating in the dark, and he realizes he can't turn it off. Sometimes the most honest critique of power is showing how good it feels before it turns poisonous. Because that's how it works in real life. Nobody signs up for the consequences. They sign up for the first high. So if Countdown King is willing to make the high look seductive, I don't automatically call that irresponsible. I call it honest. The responsibility comes in whether the show eventually forces Zion to face what he's done, emotionally if not legally. Whether it lets him rationalize forever, or whether it breaks his rationalizations. And speaking of breaking, I want to talk about the crash that triggers all of this. Not because I want to dwell on the plot mechanics, but because starting a story with a crash is such a specific statement. A crash is sudden. It's the moment your life splits into before and after. And for someone like Zion, who probably already felt like life was a series of small impacts, the crash makes that metaphor literal. The show is basically saying, the old life was unsustainable. It was going to break him one way or another. The crash is just the universe making it obvious. The way the series frames that, after, matters a lot. If the crash is treated like destiny, then Zion's rise feels preordained. If it's treated like random tragedy, then the rise feels like an accident of chaos, which is darker and, in my opinion, more interesting. Because it implies anyone could become a king if the wrong miracle happened to them at the right time. Okay, here's the pivot that I think defines the mid-story. Once Zion's gift becomes known, even in whispers, the story stops being about what he can do and starts being about who will try to own him. That's the nightmare version of any talent. Once you have something rare, people stop seeing you. They see the thing. And for someone who has been unseen his whole life, that's a twisted fulfillment. He finally has attention, but it's not love. It's appetite. You can build entire arcs out of that tension. Zion trying to keep his gift secret while his lifestyle changes too fast to hide. Zion trying to protect people from the truth while also using the truth to protect himself. Zion trying to decide whether to partner with powerful forces or stay independent and risk getting crushed. And this is where I think the show can really play with the meaning of king. A king is not free. A king is trapped by the crown. Zion might become powerful, but he might also become a figurehead for something bigger. A symbol people use. A resource people fight over. If the writers lean into that, the show becomes less about individual greed and more about systemic hunger. The city itself hungers. The market hungers. The institutions hunger. And Zion is either feeding them or being eaten. I keep coming back to a simple emotional question that's at the heart of all of this. What does Zion want, really? Does he want comfort? Does he want respect? Does he want revenge on a world that ignored him? Does he want to save people with short lifespans? Does he want to outrun his own mortality by accumulating power like armor? Because each of those wants creates a different kind of story. And the best dramas let wants evolve. They let a character think they want money, then realize they wanted safety, then realize they wanted love, then realize they wanted control because love felt too risky. And if Countdown King tracks that evolution honestly, it can hit hard. One more craft note before I move deeper into the power dynamics. I'd love if the show uses mirrors and glass as a recurring visual language. LA is full of reflective surfaces. Car windows, skyscrapers, storefronts. A man who sees hidden values would be surrounded by literal reflections, and that's such a clean metaphor for a character who's constantly seeing beneath surfaces. The camera can frame Zion through glass to suggest separation. Or to suggest he's always observing, never fully participating. And honestly, that kind of visual storytelling is what separates a drama that's merely bingeable from a drama that stays in your head. Because bingeability, to me, comes from plot momentum. Staying power comes from imagery and emotion. It's the shot you remember. It's the line that echoes. It's the moment a character's face changes and you realize they crossed a threshold. And I think Countdown King's thresholds could be genuinely memorable if it commits. Now, we should talk about the ethical center of the show, or whether it even has one. A lot of modern dramas avoid having a clear moral center because they don't want to be didactic, and I get that. But even a morally gray show has a point of view. The point of view can be, power corrupts. It can be, the world is unfair so we do what we must. It can be, trying to control fate destroys you. It can be, the system is the real villain. The interesting thing about Zion is that his power is so specific that it almost forces a point of view. Because if you can see lifespans, you can't pretend death doesn't matter. If you can see value, you can't pretend society's measurements are neutral. The show might not preach, but it can't be empty. And if it tries to be empty, if it tries to be just a slick ride with numbers and cool deals, it'll feel hollow fast. But if it leans into the discomfort, then the most powerful man in LA line stops sounding like bragging and starts sounding like a warning. There's an emotional beat I imagine the show hitting somewhere around the midpoint, and it's Zion realizing he's starting to look at people and immediately thinking, what can I gain here? And that realization, if played right, can be devastating. Because it's not like he wakes up and says, I'm evil now. It's subtler. He catches himself. He pauses half a second too long before answering someone. He hesitates before offering help because he's waiting for the number. He starts bargaining internally, and the audience sees him doing it. Those are the moments that make a character arc feel real. And since the spoiler level is moderate, I'll say this in a way that doesn't ruin any late-game mechanics. The story's escalation into Zion becoming genuinely influential should change the genre texture. Early on, it's survival drama with supernatural spice. Midway, it becomes a power drama. Boardrooms, backroom deals, alliances, betrayals. The supernatural element doesn't disappear, but it becomes the quiet advantage that fuels the political movement of the plot. And that's exciting, because it means the show can explore different kinds of tension. Not just, will he get caught, but what kind of world is he building? Because that's the real question. When someone from the bottom gains power, we like to imagine they'll fix things. But power doesn't automatically make you compassionate. Sometimes it just makes you protective of the power. And this is where I want to talk about the show's potential to explore class in a way that doesn't feel performative. Zion is a broke delivery driver. That's a specific kind of vulnerability. Not the romanticized, struggling artist vibe. The working class reality where one accident can end your life financially even if it doesn't end you physically. So when he becomes powerful, the show has a chance to dramatize how quickly society forgives you once you have money. How quickly doors open. How quickly your past becomes a hustle story instead of a problem. And I love when dramas show that hypocrisy without over-explaining it. Just a scene where the same type of person who dismissed Zion before suddenly laughs at his jokes when he's wearing a watch that costs more than a car. That kind of detail is sharp. It lands because it's true. So yeah, I'm fascinated by this premise. But fascination doesn't automatically equal endorsement. The execution has to keep making choices. It has to keep surprising us, not with random twists, but with moral turns that feel inevitable in hindsight. And speaking of inevitability, the countdown element gives the writers a built-in way to create dread that isn't just plot-based. If Zion sees someone's time is short, every scene with that person becomes loaded. Even if nothing happened in the scene. Even if they are just talking. The audience is sitting there thinking, is this the last time? Is he going to tell them? Is he going to use this? Is he going to save them? Or is he going to let the countdown run because it benefits him? That's not a cheap cliffhanger. That's existential suspense. The next thing I want to dig into is how Zion's gift would realistically change his body language as he becomes more powerful, because that's where performance and writing fuse into character, and it's also where I think the show can quietly reveal whether Zion is becoming confident or becoming numb, because those two can look similar on the surface, but they feel totally different when you're watching closely. Like, early Zion probably moves like he's apologizing for taking up space. Later Zion might move like the room belongs to him. But the truly chilling version is when he moves like the room doesn't feel real anymore, like he's walking through other people's lives as if they are projections and he's the only solid thing left. And that's the exact kind of transformation that can happen when you start believing the numbers more than you believe the people standing in front of you. Which is why the scenes where Zion has to sit across from someone who clearly isn't afraid of him yet are so important, because that's when you get to see whether he still has that old fear in him or whether he's learned to hide it so well that even he can't find it anymore, and the show can either make that terrifying or it can accidentally make it flat depending on how it frames those encounters. Because if the camera treats Zion like a hero in those moments, you start rooting for domination, but if it treats Zion like a man balancing on the edge of becoming something he won't recognize, then every quiet conversation becomes a kind of horror scene, and that's where Countdown King, at least in concept, feels like it really wants to live, right on that edge where you're watching a rise and feeling your stomach drop at the same time. Because if it treats Zion like a man balancing on the edge of becoming something he won't recognize, then every quiet conversation becomes a kind of horror scene, and that's where Countdown King, at least in concept, feels like it really wants to live, right on that edge where you're watching a rise and feeling your stomach drop at the same time. And honestly, that's why I keep coming back to performance as the make-or-break ingredient here. A lot of people think a Power Rise show is all about plot twists and big moves. But the truth is, you can write the slickest schemes in the world, and if the actor playing Zion doesn't sell the internal shift, it's just a highlight reel of events. What I want from a character like this is that slow recalibration in the eyes. The way he starts making longer eye contact. The way he stops nodding automatically when someone talks down to him. The way his voice changes, not into some cartoon villain purr, but into something more measured, like he's constantly weighing whether this conversation is worth the air it takes to finish the sentence. Here's where I get picky, though. Because there's a version of measured acting that's actually just flat. It's the classic, stoic antihero problem, where the lead plays everything the same, and the show thinks that's depth. I don't want Zion to be stoic. I want him to be controlled. There's a difference. Stoic is empty. Controlled is full, it's just contained. Controlled has pressure behind it. You should feel the lid rattling. And if the series nails that, it can do something really fun with tension. The more powerful Zion becomes, the less he has to react externally. So the show has to rely on micro-tension. A tight smile. A pause that goes on one beat too long. A hand that stays still when it wants to fidget. It's like watching someone learn to speak the language of power, and that language is mostly silence. But here's the twisty emotional hook for me: if Zion becomes fluent in that language, does he lose the ability to be understood by the people who loved him before he learned it? Because that's the heartbreak of upward mobility stories. It's not just that you leave your old life behind. It's that you come back and you realize you can't translate yourself anymore. You try to talk about your day and it sounds like you're bragging. You try to express fear and it sounds like you're complaining. You try to share excitement and it sounds like you're selling something. And the people who used to get you start looking at you like you're a stranger wearing your face. I'll come back to that idea, because it's one of those themes that can either quietly haunt the whole series or get tossed aside when the plot gets louder. Let's talk about the show's supernatural mechanics again, but through a craft lens. Seeing lifespans, hidden values, and future fortunes is 3 powers in one, and that's a lot. I'm not automatically against it, but it does create a balancing problem. The more abilities you stack, the harder it is to keep the story from feeling like the lead can solve anything. So the writers have to create limitations that feel organic. Not, it only works on Tuesdays. Limitations that come from Zion himself. Like, maybe the power isn't just information. Maybe it's a sensation. Maybe it hurts. Maybe it overwhelms him in crowds. Maybe he starts avoiding people because he can't stop seeing what they don't want him to see. Maybe he tries substances or rituals to numb it, not in some edgy way, but in a very human, I want quiet inside my own head way. That's where the story can get psychologically real without needing to invent a bunch of lore. And that psychological realism matters, because the show is dealing with a really intimate kind of violation. Zion's gift, depending on how it's framed, is basically non-consensual access to other people's most private information. Their time. Their worth, as the world measures it. Their trajectory. If the series wants to be thoughtful, it can't ignore that. Even if Zion is sympathetic, what he's doing by simply looking is intrusive. So the question becomes, does Zion ever feel guilty for knowing? Or does he convince himself that knowing is neutral and only actions have morality? That's one of those philosophical debates that sounds abstract until you put it in a scene and you watch a person's face fall because Zion has just learned something he shouldn't know, and he can't unlearn it. Now, let me drop you into a mini-scene, the kind of moment I imagine this show either absolutely nails or totally fumbles. Picture Zion in a glossy space for the first time. Not some stereotypical cartoon mansion, but an office that's too clean, too expensive, too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels purchased. Someone powerful is talking to him, offering something. The camera frames Zion slightly off-center, like the room is swallowing him. You can hear the soft buzz of the city outside, muted by thick glass. The other person slides a contract across the desk, and Zion's eyes flick down, but not to the words. To the person. And we get it from Zion's perspective for a flash, a set of numbers, a shimmer, a sense of, this is what this moment is worth. Maybe there's a subtle ticking sound that wasn't there before, not loud, just enough to make your skin tighten. Zion smiles, because that's what he's learned to do when he's nervous, but the smile doesn't reach his eyes. His fingers hover over the pen, and you can tell he's not thinking, should I take this deal? He's thinking, what does this deal make me? Then he signs. And the show doesn't hit you with fireworks. It hits you with a quiet shift. The way the other person's posture relaxes because they've just acquired something. The way Zion's shoulders drop like he's relieved, and then his jaw tightens as if his body realized the cost a second late. That's the kind of scene that can turn this from a slick concept into a character tragedy. And here's the thing, you don't need to specify what the deal is to make it land. You just need to make it feel like the first time Zion chooses the crown over the person. This is where the writing has to be disciplined. A lot of dramas want to rush past those threshold moments because they are eager to get to the king era. But the threshold moments are the show. That's where the audience forms their relationship with Zion. That's where we decide whether we're watching a cautionary tale, a power fantasy, or something thornier in between. There's also a narrative pacing trick that I think Countdown King almost has to use to stay addictive, alternating between wins that feel exhilarating and wins that feel sour. The exhilarating wins are what keep you binging. The sour wins are what keep you thinking. If every victory is purely triumphant, the show becomes shallow. If every victory is misery, the show becomes exhausting. The sweet spot is when you're cheering and then immediately asking yourself why you're cheering. And that's where the future fortunes element can be so wicked. Because it creates the illusion of certainty. Zion can pick the winner. Zion can pick the moment. Zion can always be on the right side of the trade, the right side of the deal, the right side of the room. And when a character believes they can't lose, that's when they start taking risks that are less about need and more about ego. Ego is the quiet villain in stories like this. Not greed. Greed is understandable. Greed is hunger. Ego is the part that says, I deserve this. Ego is the part that says, I'm smarter than everyone. Ego is the part that says, the rules don't apply to me because I can see the rules. But here's where I want to complicate it. Zion's ego, if it grows, isn't just personal vanity. It's also a defense mechanism. When you've been made small your whole life, power doesn't just inflate you. It protects you from ever being made small again. And that's why characters cling to it even when it poisons them. They are not just chasing luxury. They are chasing dignity. They are chasing safety. They are chasing the right to exist without fear. So when people ask, why didn't he just stop, that question always makes me laugh a little, not because it's dumb, but because it assumes stopping is easy. Stopping means going back. And for someone like Zion, going back might feel like dying. The part that really tests the show, in my eyes, is how it handles Zion's relationships once he's in the upper layers of power. Because there's a lazy way to write that, everyone becomes jealous, everyone becomes an enemy, Zion becomes isolated because people are haters. That's the cheap route. The richer route is when the relationships break for reasons that hurt because they are legitimate. A friend doesn't trust Zion anymore because Zion won't answer simple questions. A partner starts feeling emotionally unsafe because Zion seems like he's always watching, always calculating. Someone from his past feels abandoned because Zion's time, attention, and presence are now moneized by the life he's built. None of that requires anyone to be a villain. It just requires the story to admit that power changes the texture of love. And this is one of those places where the lifespan ability can be used for maximum emotional damage without spoiling any big late twist. Imagine Zion looking at someone he cares about and seeing a number that is suddenly, inexplicably shorter than it used to be. Not because the show needs a shock, but because it forces him into panic. It forces him into control mode. It forces him to intervene. And interventions, in a show like this, never simple. That's a rehook worth sitting with. When Zion tries to save someone, is he saving them for them, or is he saving them for himself? Because that's where the show can get brutal. Zion's gift can make him hyperprotective in a way that feels loving on the surface but is actually controlling. If you can see someone's time is running out, you might start deciding what they should do with their remaining time. You might start policing their choices. You might start treating them like a fragile object rather than a person with agency. And if the show goes there, it becomes not just a power story, but a story about the violence of knowing better than someone else. One of the most interesting thematic layers in the premise is that Zion's power is a kind of hyper-capitalist vision. He sees value. He sees fortune. He sees time as a resource. That's literally how capitalism trains us to think, just pushed into supernatural territory. So a smart drama would use Zion to interrogate that mindset. Not with speeches, but with consequences. Like, what happens when Zion starts optimizing everything? When he starts selecting friends and partners and allies the way you'd select investments. At first, it might look like competence. People will call him disciplined, strategic, ambitious. But slowly, the show can reveal the emotional wasteland behind that optimization. Because life isn't meant to be optimized. Life is meant to be lived. And optimizing it usually means sanding down everything messy and human until all you have left is efficiency. And efficiency is cold. There's another craft element I want to spotlight, the way editing can tell you what kind of king Zion is becoming. If the show cuts quickly during his deal-making scenes, it can make him feel like a shark, fast and relentless. If the show uses longer takes, it can make him feel like a predator who doesn't need to rush, because time is on his side. Both can work, but they communicate different kinds of power. A lot of modern dramas chase slickness as a default. They want fast cuts, flashy music, constant motion. But I actually think a story about time benefits from patience. The longer you hold on a face, the more you feel time. The longer you sit in silence, the more you feel the countdown. So if Countdown King chooses to slow down at key moments, that's not boring. That's thematically aligned. That's the show making you sit in the discomfort of knowing. Another thing that's quietly important is how the show treats violence, even if the violence is mostly implied. Power stories tend to escalate into physical danger eventually, because that's the language of high stakes. But Zion's most interesting conflicts don't have to be shootouts or car chases. They can be conversations where someone tries to corner him with a question he can't answer without revealing his gift. They can be meetings where he's being tested. They can be moments where the threat is social death rather than literal death. And honestly, social death is the more relevant fear for a character like Zion. If his power is tied to his position, if his influence is built on perception and access, then humiliation could be catastrophic. Exposure could be catastrophic. Being labeled a fraud could be catastrophic. Those are the stakes that keep the show grounded in psychological reality even when the premise is supernatural. Here's a surprising take I want to lean into, because I think some people might disagree with me. In a show like this, I don't actually need a single, big bad, villain to anchor the narrative. I know audiences love a clear antagonist, and it can be satisfying. But I think Countdown King's strongest potential enemy is the system itself, embodied by multiple faces. A different kind of predator in every room. The banker predator. The politician predator. The influencer predator. The I'm helping you predator. The we're family predator. The I'm just doing business predator. Because that's real. The world doesn't usually crush you with one person's evil. It crushes you with 1,000 small hungers, 1,000 small compromises, 1,000 people asking for a piece of you. So if the show's antagonist energy is dispersed like that, I actually think it could feel more truthful and more suffocating. It would also keep Zion's paranoia justified without needing to turn the plot into a simplistic hero versus villain chess match. But it's risky, because a dispersed antagonist can also feel unfocused if the writing doesn't keep a strong through line. The through line, ideally, is Zion's internal transformation. The external threats are just the weather. And speaking of weather, let's talk about mood. I love it when LA set dramas remember that the city isn't only bright. It's hazy. It's sodium streetlights. It's the soft orange wash of night. It's the weird loneliness of driving on a wide road with too many lanes, surrounded by people, and still feeling isolated. A show about power should feel lonely even when it's glamorous. That's the contradiction. That's the point. If Countdown King nails that mood, the production design should evolve with Zion's status. Early spaces feel cramped, lived in, messy in a human way. Mid-level spaces feel transitional, like he's upgrading but still doesn't belong. High-level spaces feel museum clean, like no one actually lives there, they just perform living. And I'd love if the show uses that to visually communicate Zion's identity crisis. When you don't belong, you touch things differently. You sit differently. You don't fully relax. And when you finally do belong, sometimes it's because you've killed the part of you that used to care about belonging. That's the trade. Here's another question to keep us hooked. What does Zion do with the knowledge of lifespans when it stops being abstract and starts being personal? Because it's one thing to see strangers as countdowns. It's another thing to see someone you love with a number you can't handle. And it's another thing again to see your own world shrinking, not because of death necessarily, but because your gift is eating your humanity. The show has a chance to do something really raw there. It can make Zion's gift function like trauma. Like hypervigilance. Like that constant scanning you do when you've been hurt before. The numbers become a metaphor for the way anxiety reduces life to threat assessment. If you've ever lived in survival mode, you know what I mean. You walk into a room and your brain immediately starts reading exits, faces, tones, risks. Zion just has a supernatural overlay on top of it. And that's where I might connect to him more than I'd like to admit. Because I'm the kind of person who, when I'm stressed, starts trying to predict everything. I'll replay conversations. I'll game out outcomes. I'll try to control the future in my head so I don't get blindsided. It's not healthy, it's just familiar. So watching a character with literal future vision lean into that controlling mindset can feel uncomfortably relatable. And if the show leans into that, it stops being just about money and power. It becomes about the psychological cost of knowing. Now, let's touch on something fans always debate in these dramas. Does the show justify the protagonist too much? Does it excuse him? Does it punish him? And my answer is, I don't actually need the show to punish Zion in a tidy way. I need it to be honest about cause and effect. If Zion does something that breaks trust, I want the trust to break. If Zion treats people like numbers, I want people to feel dehumanized. If Zion becomes manipulative, I want his love life to feel poisoned by that. That's not moral punishment. That's just consequences. And consequences are the difference between a serious drama and a fantasy where the lead gets to be awful without the story noticing. One of the things I hope Countdown King does, structurally, is allow for moments of stillness where Zion can't hide behind action. The temptation with a plot-driven premise is to keep moving. Deal, betrayal, counter-deal, escalation, bigger deal. But a character like Zion needs moments where he's alone. Moments where he stares at a ceiling. Moments where the ticking is loud because there's nothing else to distract him. Those are the scenes that separate cool from good. Music is also crucial in those moments. A heavy score can tell you what to feel, but sometimes you want the opposite. You want the hum of a refrigerator. You want distant sirens. You want footsteps in a hallway. You want reality. Because reality is the thing Zion is losing touch with if he starts living in numbers. And here's where I'm going to be slightly critical, just as a general warning sign with this kind of series. If Countdown King leans too heavily into Zion becomes the most powerful man in Los Angeles as a triumph, it risks flattening the early emotional stakes. The show has to keep reminding us who Zion was. Not with flashbacks necessarily, but with emotional echoes. With choices that show the old self struggling inside the new self. Otherwise the arc becomes a straight line, and straight lines are boring. What we want is a spiral. The kind of spiral where Zion thinks he's moving upward, but he keeps passing the same moral questions at higher and higher stakes. And this is where the hidden values can do some really interesting thematic work. Because the show can challenge Zion's perception of value over time. Early Zion might assume value equals money. Mid-Zion might learn value equals leverage. Later Zion might realize value equals loyalty, or value equals time. Or value equals peace. And the tragedy could be that by the time he learns that, he's already spent the things that were truly valuable. That's a story. That's a gut punch. Let's shift into how this drama might land for different kinds of viewers, without me turning this into a consumer guide. If you're someone who loves fast-paced thrillers, the fortune-reading element can keep you engaged because it naturally creates, what's the play, tension. You're constantly watching Zion calculate. If you're someone who loves character studies, the lifespan reading element is where the emotional meat is, because it forces Zion into moral and existential crises. If you're someone who loves social commentary, the hidden values concept is basically begging to be read as a critique of how society assigns worth. But the risk, and this is important, is that the show tries to serve all three audiences and ends up satisfying none. It has to decide what its core pleasure is. Is it the chess game? Is it the tragedy? Is it the critique? Ideally it's a blend, but the blend needs a dominant flavor. And for me, personally, I want the tragedy. I want the show to scare me with how understandable Zion's choices are. I want it to make me look at my own obsession with security and ask, okay, where does that lead if I never stop? Another rehook, because we're approaching the most volatile part of the premise, the moment Zion's gift stops being a secret advantage and starts reshaping the city around him. That's when the story gets big. And big stories can either become epic or become messy. If the show handles that expansion well, it should feel like ripples. Zion does something small, and suddenly it affects other people's fortunes, other people's decisions, other people's survival. That ripple effect can create a network of consequences that makes the world feel alive. The city starts reacting to him. And Zion, ironically, becomes less free because he's now responsible for outcomes he didn't intend. But if the show handles it poorly, it becomes a parade of new characters and new subplots that feel like they are there to prolong the climb. That's when viewers start feeling fatigue. That's when the premise starts feeling like it's being milked instead of explored. So the writing has to be ruthless about what matters. Not ruthless like shock value. Ruthless like every new power play has to reveal something about Zion. And you can do that by making his choices mirror each other. Early on, Zion might exploit a situation to pay a bill. Later, he might exploit a situation to crush a rival. Same behavior, different scale. That's character development. Or character erosion. Chemistry is another huge factor I haven't fully unpacked yet. Whoever Zion is closest to, romantically or platonically, becomes the emotional anchor for the audience. And the chemistry can't just be, they look good together. It needs to feel like there's a genuine exchange. A push and pull. A sense that Zion is more himself around this person, until he isn't. Because that's the tragedy of power, it doesn't just change you. It changes how people respond to you. Some people get intimidated. Some people get attracted. Some people get resentful. Some people get opportunistic. The relationship becomes a mirror, and the show can use that mirror to show Zion what he's becoming. One of the most painful arcs a drama like this can do, mid-story, is the "you changed" conversation. It's so common it can be cliché, but if it's written with specificity, it can be devastating. Not, "you're different now," in a generic way. More like, "you don't listen anymore. You're always somewhere else when I'm talking. You look at me like I'm a problem to solve." That kind of line cuts because it's about presence, not morality. And it's also the kind of line that would land extra hard in a show where the protagonist is literally seeing overlays of information while people speak. Zion might genuinely struggle to be present. He might not even realize he's doing it. He might think he's being helpful, being strategic, being protective. And the other person feels like they're being erased. That's a very modern fear, by the way. Being treated like data. Being treated like an outcome. Being treated like a means. The show's supernatural metaphor maps too cleanly onto how people feel in a world run by metrics. And I can't ignore that. Because it's why the premise resonates. We all feel a little quantified these days, whether it's money, social media, productivity, whatever. Countdown King just makes the quantification visible. Now, there's one more thing about the lifespan element that I think could either elevate the show into something special or make it feel manipulative, depending on execution. If the show uses lifespan reveals purely for shock, it becomes cheap. Like, "Oh wow, this random person is going to die soon, surprise." That's not interesting. What's interesting is using lifespan knowledge to explore how people behave when time feels finite. And Zion, by seeing it, forces finitude into rooms where people pretend they have forever. That can create some incredible tension. Imagine a powerful person making threats, acting invincible, and Zion can see they have very little time left. Does Zion treat them differently? Does he feel superior? Does he feel pity? Does he take advantage? Those are all character-revealing responses. And if the show is smart, it doesn't let Zion have one consistent response. Sometimes he'll be compassionate. Sometimes he'll be cruel. Sometimes he'll be shaken. Sometimes he'll be numb. The inconsistency is the point. It's a human being trying to adapt to impossible knowledge. And I want to emphasize that word, impossible. Because seeing lifespans is impossible knowledge. Humans aren't designed to carry it. That's why even when Zion is winning, the show should never feel fully comfortable. It should feel like he's holding a live wire. Let's bring cinematography back in, because there's a way to shoot Zion's rise that makes the audience complicit. Early on, the camera might be handheld, closer, more intimate, more chaotic. As Zion gains power, the camera can become more stable, more symmetrical, more controlled. That visual stability feels like security. It feels like success. And you, as the viewer, start associating control with comfort. Then the show can disrupt that. It can destabilize the frame when Zion is emotionally unraveling even if his life looks perfect. It can bring back handheld movement in the clean spaces. It can introduce a subtle tilt. It can make you feel like something is off even when the dialogue says everything is fine. That's the kind of filmmaking I love, because it respects the audience. It uses the language of cinema to tell the emotional truth. And if Countdown King doesn't do that, if it shoots everything with the same flat coverage, then the story has to do all the heavy lifting with dialogue, which is harder, and it can make the show feel more generic than its premise deserves. Another thing I'd be curious about is how the show handles the ethics of Zion's power in terms of consent and privacy. Not with courtroom drama energy, but with interpersonal realism. Like, if Zion is in a relationship and he's hiding the gift, that's already a breach of trust. If he reveals it, that creates a different kind of breach, because now the other person knows Zion can see things they might not want him to see. That's a unique intimacy problem. It's like dating someone who can read your mind, except it's worse because the information is numerical and objective, which makes it harder to argue with. Imagine trying to say, "No, I'm fine," and Zion can see your value plummet or your fortune dim or your lifespan shorten. Even if those readings aren't directly tied to your emotional state, Zion might interpret them that way. He might start correcting you. And the relationship turns into Zion managing you. That's not love. That's control disguised as care. And if the show explores that, it becomes deeply uncomfortable in a good way. It becomes a critique of certain kinds of relationships where one person believes they know what's best and uses that belief to override the other person's autonomy. Now, there's also a potential redemptive path in stories like this, and I'm not saying the show needs redemption, but it's worth talking about. A drama can let its protagonist spiral without making the ending a simple punishment. Sometimes the most moving resolution is a character realizing what they've become and making one choice that doesn't fix everything but does reclaim a piece of their humanity. But I'm not going to go into ending territory. I'm staying moderate spoiler, and also, I don't want to reduce a show's emotional impact to, does he get punished or not? That's not the only measure of narrative satisfaction. Narrative satisfaction, for me, comes from thematic follow-through. If the show spends all this time asking what happens when you can quantify life, it needs to end up saying something about what can't be quantified. Even if that something is bleak. Even if that something is ambiguous. It needs to land on a feeling that matches the journey. And I think that's what makes Countdown King such a potentially compelling project. It's built around numbers, but the real question is whether Zion can find something that the numbers can't measure. Here's a small aside before I keep going, because I know someone's going to comment it. Yes, I am aware I'm psychoanalyzing a fictional delivery driver with magic eyes like he's my cousin who just got promoted and stopped texting back. That's what we do here. That's the hobby. Okay. Let's push into the most powerful man in Los Angeles idea again, because this phrase can mean a lot of things, and each interpretation changes the tone of the show. If powerful means wealthy, then the show becomes a critique of money as destiny. If powerful means feared, then it becomes a critique of violence and intimidation. If powerful means influential, then it becomes a critique of institutions and networks. If powerful means he can change fortunes, then it becomes almost mythological, like Zion is turning into a modern-day oracle with the ability to shape reality. The version that excites me most is the influence version. Because influence is slippery. It's not just what you have. It's what people think you have. It's what people believe you can do to them. And Zion's gift is perfectly suited for that, because information is power, but it's also rumor. It's also myth. People will project onto him. They'll fear him. They'll worship him. They'll try to exploit him. And Zion will have to decide what kind of symbol he becomes. That's rich. That's drama. And that's where the show can explore the loneliness of being perceived. When you become powerful, people stop seeing your humanity and start seeing your legend. And Zion, coming from invisibility, might initially love that. He might crave it. He might finally feel real. But eventually, being turned into a symbol becomes another kind of erasure. That's the paradox. He escapes being a nobody by becoming an idea, and ideas don't get to be human. Now, I want to dig into structure a bit more, because a show like this typically has a few distinct arcs even if it flows smoothly. There's the awakening arc, where Zion discovers the power and tests it. There's the hustle arc, where he uses it to stabilize his life and gain small wins. There's the expansion arc, where bigger players enter the orbit and Zion's choices start affecting more than just him. And then there's usually a reckoning arc, where the consequences and the psychological toll become impossible to ignore. The reason I'm laying that out in broad strokes is because it helps explain why some viewers might fall off in the middle. The hustle arc is addictive because it's tangible. It's watch him use the power. The expansion arc can feel like a genre shift, and if you came for scrappy underdog vibes, you might feel disoriented when the show becomes more political and strategic. But that shift is also what makes the premise worth a full series. Because if Zion stayed scrappy forever, it would be repetitive. The entire point of King is transformation. The show has to change its skin as Zion changes his. So if you're watching and you hit that middle stretch where it feels like the stakes are getting more complex, I'd encourage you to read that complexity as intentional. It's the narrative reflecting Zion's world widening. The question is whether the show keeps the emotional clarity even as the plot web grows. Another re-hook. Because this is the moment that decides whether the show becomes truly great or just very watchable, when Zion starts using the lifespan vision not as a burden, but as leverage. That's the moral cliff. And a drama has to earn it. If Zion does that too early, you lose empathy. If he never does it, you lose the edge. The perfect timing is when you can see exactly why he does it and you still feel sick about it. And if the show goes there, the acting has to sell the self-justification. Because people rarely see themselves as villains. Zion will tell himself it's necessary. He'll tell himself he's preventing worse outcomes. He'll tell himself that the person he's exploiting would do the same to him. He'll tell himself that the world is cruel, so he's just adapting. That rationalization is what makes it real. That's what makes it scary. One of the hardest things to write convincingly is a character who is both right and wrong at the same time. Right that the world is unfair. Wrong in how they respond. Right to want safety. Wrong to treat people as tools. Right to be angry. Wrong to turn anger into a weapon pointed at anyone nearby. If Countdown King can sit in that contradiction without collapsing into simplistic messaging, it can hit a level of nuance that a lot of genre dramas don't reach. And by the way, I'm not saying it has to be subtle all the time. This is still entertainment. You can have big, operatic confrontations. You can have high-stakes deals. You can have a sense of escalation. But the emotional logic underneath has to stay coherent. Let's talk about the title again, because Countdown King has that double meaning that I can't let go of. A king is supposed to rule. A countdown is supposed to end. So the title almost implies that Zion's reign is temporary. Not necessarily because he dies, but because all power has a shelf life. Fortunes turn. Alliances shift. Cities chew people up. If the show is self-aware, it will keep reminding us that being most powerful is not a stable state. It's a moment. And moments end. That sense of impermanence is what can give the show its bittersweet edge. Even when Zion wins, you're watching a sandcastle being built at the tide line. Another angle I think the show can explore, and this is a big one thematically, is whether Zion's gift is truly supernatural or whether it's a metaphor for learning to see the world as it is. Because when you come from poverty, you learn to read runes. You learn to detect danger. You learn to spot opportunities. You learn to recognize when someone is lying to you because you can't afford to be naive. Zion's power could be read as an externalization of that survival skill. He's always been reading the world, now he can literally see the readings. If the show plays with that idea, then Zion's tragedy becomes even more pointed. His gift isn't making him inhuman. It's amplifying a skill he developed to survive in an inhuman system. The more he uses it, the more he becomes what the system rewards: cold, calculating, efficient. So the show becomes less about magic changes a man, and more about the world was always built to turn people into this. And that's where the drama can land a serious punch without feeling preachy. Because it's not telling you what to think. It's showing you how a person gets made. Now, I want to touch on something that's easy to ignore but really important: humor, or the lack of it. A heavy premise like this needs some breathing room. Not sitcom jokes, but moments of human absurdity. Moments where Zion is still a person. Moments where the power creates awkwardness instead of only dread. Like, imagine Zion trying to have a normal conversation in a line at a coffee shop and the numbers keep popping up and he's trying not to stare. Or imagine him meeting someone who is completely unimpressed by wealth and power and treats him like a regular guy, and Zion doesn't know how to act because he's so used to being either dismissed or feared. Those moments of awkward humanity can make the darkness hit harder when it returns. But again, it has to be calibrated. If the show gets too jokey, the lifespan element becomes tonal whiplash. If the show gets too grim, it becomes emotionally monotonous. The best dramas are the ones that let you laugh just enough to lower your guard. Let's pivot to audience impact, because I think this show, depending on execution, could spark some intense conversations. The concept of seeing hidden values is basically an invitation for viewers to ask, what do I value? What does society value? What gets rewarded? What gets punished? And those questions aren't abstract. They are personal. People will project their own experiences onto Zion's choices. And that's why fandom discourse around a show like this can get spicy. You'll have viewers who see Zion as a hero for gaming a rigged system. You'll have viewers who see him as a villain for perpetuating the same harm. You'll have viewers who focus on the romance, if there is one, and argue about whether Zion deserves love. You'll have viewers who focus on the social critique and get frustrated if the show doesn't go far enough. And honestly, I kind of love that. I love when a drama is messy enough to generate real disagreement, not because it's poorly written, but because it touches nerves. Because it forces viewers to confront their own relationship with ambition and morality. Now, I'm going to keep this in moderate spoiler territory, but I do want to talk about the kind of mid-story turning point that would make this series truly memorable. It's not a twist reveal. It's a choice. A moment where Zion realizes he can't stay clean and still win. Where someone essentially tells him, maybe not in words, that the price of entry is compromise. Those are the moments where a show reveals what it believes about the world. Does it believe that staying moral is possible within corrupt systems? Does it believe that power inevitably corrupts? Does it believe that there's a third path, some kind of creative resistance? And more importantly, what does Zion believe? Because Zion's belief system is the spine of the narrative. He doesn't have to be consistent. In fact, inconsistency is realistic. But the show needs to track his justifications. It needs to show how he rewrites his own story to live with himself. And that's where writing quality becomes visible. Bad writing makes characters change because the plot needs them to. Good writing makes characters change because their internal logic evolves, even if that logic is flawed. I also want to highlight something about future fortunes that can be thematically potent. Fortune isn't just money. Fortune is luck. It's timing. It's who you meet. It's who takes an interest in you. Zion's gift could make him obsessed with controlling luck. And when you get obsessed with controlling luck, you start seeing randomness as a threat. You start needing everything to have a reason. Everything to be predictable. Everything to be manageable. That's a recipe for paranoia. And paranoia is such a delicious ingredient in a drama like this, because it can be both justified and self-destructive. Zion lives in a world where powerful people really are out to use him. So his paranoia is rational. But the more paranoid he becomes, the more he pushes away the few people who might actually care about him. So the paranoia creates the isolation that makes the paranoia worse. It's a loop. If the show nails that loop, it can create this suffocating emotional momentum where you feel like Zion is running on a treadmill that's speeding up, and he can't step off without falling. Here's another craft detail that would elevate scenes like that, using shallow depth of field when Zion is overwhelmed, making the world behind people blur into abstraction, emphasizing that he's locked onto the numbers and not the person. Then, in moments where he reconnects with humanity, the show could deepen focus, letting the environment come back, letting reality return. That's visual storytelling that mirrors psychology. And I know, I'm the type of person who will pause a scene and be like, look at the lens choice, and then immediately roast myself for it. But that's what long-form reviewing does to your brain. Another rehook, because there's a massive emotional question hovering over this entire concept. If Zion can see endings, does that make him kinder, or does it make him crueler faster? In a lot of stories, the awareness of mortality makes characters more compassionate. They cherish time. They appreciate people. They stop sweating small stuff. But there's another possible response to mortality, and it's domination. It's the, time is short, so I need to secure my position at any cost, response. It's the, I can't be vulnerable because vulnerability wastes time, response. And Zion, coming from instability, might be more likely to choose domination because compassion can feel like a luxury when you've been starving. So if the show has any real teeth, it'll show that tension. Zion having moments where he wants to be kind, and then something in him snaps back into survival calculus. Kindness becomes risky. Kindness becomes inefficient. Kindness becomes something he promises himself he'll do later, once he's safe. And later never comes, because safety is a moving target. That is painfully real. Now, let's talk about the king aesthetic. If the show is self-aware, it might start dressing Zion differently, styling him in ways that communicate his transformation. And I'm not just talking about, he wears a suit now. I'm talking about the way his clothes fit. The way his colors shift. The way the camera lights him. Early Zion might be lit harshly, emphasizing tiredness. Later Zion might be lit softly, emphasizing polish. Or, if the show is darker, later Zion might be lit with sharper contrast, emphasizing hardness. Wardrobe and lighting are storytelling. They are not decoration. They tell you how the show wants you to see the character. And I'd be fascinated if the show ever deliberately breaks that. Like, Zion returns to an old neighborhood or an old job environment, and suddenly the lighting becomes harsh again, the camera becomes closer, the sound becomes more raw. The show visually reminding you that no matter how high he climbs, the past still exists. It still has gravity. That brings me to one of my favorite themes in any Rise story, the myth of escape. People think money lets you escape who you were. But most of the time, money just gives you a different stage to act out the same wounds. Zion's gift doesn't heal his insecurity. It amplifies it. Because now he's responsible not only for his survival, but for his fate. And when you feel responsible for fate, you never rest. You never forgive yourself. You never let anything be. That's a psychological hell. A shiny one, but still hell. And in terms of narrative engine, that's what keeps the show moving. The engine isn't, can Zion get rich? The engine is, can Zion ever feel safe? And the darker answer is, no, because safety isn't a bank account. Safety is a relationship with uncertainty. And Zion's entire gift is about reducing uncertainty, which paradoxically makes uncertainty more terrifying. I want to shift into something that might be controversial. I think it's okay if the show doesn't fully explain the origin of Zion's power. I know some viewers hate that. They want lore. They want rules. They want a mythology. But for a story like this, too much explanation can deflate the metaphor. If the power becomes just a supernatural gadget with a detailed origin story, you risk losing the symbolic weight. Sometimes it's better if it feels like a strange curse that happened, and the focus stays on what Zion does with it. Now, that doesn't mean the show should be sloppy. It should be consistent in how the power behaves. But it doesn't need to give you a neat, "here is why the universe chose Zion." In fact, I think it's more unsettling if it feels arbitrary. Because that implies anyone could be given the same weapon, and the difference would be what kind of person they are when it happens. That's a more uncomfortable thought than, he was chosen because he's special. And Zion doesn't need to be special. He needs to be human. Another thing the show can do, mid to late, without spoiling specifics, is start turning the power against Zion's own sense of identity. If he can see hidden values in others, what happens when he looks at himself? Does he see a number? Does he see emptiness? Does he see a fortune that doesn't feel like his? Does he see his own lifespan and panic? Does he start obsessing over extending it, not physically, but symbolically, by building a legacy? Legacy is another kind of immortality people chase when mortality scares them. And kings, historically, obsessed with legacy. Not because they are noble, but because they are terrified of being forgotten. Zion, coming from invisibility, might crave legacy even more intensely. He might want to be seen. He might want to matter. And that desire, again, is understandable. It's also dangerous. Because the desire to matter can make you justify a lot. I'm going to stop on that for a second, because it's one of the most honest human desires, to matter. To not be disposable. To not be replaceable. To not be forgotten. Zion's whole starting point as a delivery driver is disposability. People treat him like an extension of an app. So when he becomes powerful, part of what he's reclaiming is personhood. But the tragedy is that in chasing personhood through power, he might lose the very empathy that makes personhood meaningful. And if that's what Countdown King is ultimately about, it's not just a drama. It's a modern parable. Now, I want to talk briefly about how the show could handle secondary characters in a way that supports that parable. The danger with a Zion-centric power fantasy is that everyone else becomes either an obstacle or a tool. That's what Zion's mindset might do, but the show itself doesn't have to replicate that. The show can give side characters interiority. It can give them their own values, their own fears, their own agency. Even if Zion sees them as numbers, the camera doesn't have to. The writing doesn't have to. In fact, one of the most effective critiques of a protagonist's dehumanization is letting the world remain human around them. Letting side characters have scenes where Zion isn't present. Letting their consequences ripple in ways Zion can't fully control. Because if Zion becomes the center of the universe in the show's storytelling, it accidentally endorses his king fantasy. If the show shows you that the city is bigger than him, that lives continue beyond his calculations, then it keeps the thematic tension alive. That's the difference between a drama that glamorizes power and a drama that examines it. Another rehook, because this is where the premise can get genuinely chilling, the moment Zion's gift makes him start seeing death not as tragedy, but as timing. Timing is what businessmen talk about. Timing is what investors talk about. Timing is what opportunists talk about. It's the most clinical way to speak about life-changing events. So if Zion starts seeing death as timing, the show has crossed into truly dark territory. Not because Zion becomes a mustache-twirling villain, but because he becomes numb. And numbness is scarier than rage. Rage can be reasoned with. Numbness can't. And if the actor can portray numbness as a survival adaptation rather than a cool aesthetic, it can hit hard. Because you'll recognize it. You'll see that Zion isn't evil, he's overwhelmed and he's adapted in the only way he knows how. Now, you might be wondering, okay, does the show ever give us catharsis? Does it ever let us breathe? And I think it has too, at least in moments. Even tragedies need relief. Even dark character studies need sparks of light, not to excuse the darkness, but to make it hurt more when the light goes out. So I'd expect the show to have sequences where Zion genuinely feels joy. Not performative joy. Real joy. Maybe it's the first time he pays off something that's been crushing him. Maybe it's the first time he buys something without calculating whether it will ruin him. Maybe it's a moment of connection where he forgets the numbers for a second and just laughs like a person. Those moments matter. Because they remind you what the climb was for. They also remind you what gets lost when the climb becomes the point. And I'll be honest, those are the moments that tend to get me emotional. I don't always cry at the big dramatic confrontations. I cry at relief. I cry at a character who finally exhales. Because if you've ever been in survival mode, you know how rare that exhale is. So if Countdown King gives Cyan a moment like that and then later takes it away, yeah, I'm probably going to sit there quietly wrecked, pretending I'm fine, and then immediately queue up the next episode like a responsible adult. One more element I want to explore is how the show might comment on meritocracy. Because a rise story in America always brushes up against the myth that success is earned purely through hard work. Cyan's power complicates that. He's not just working hard. He has an unfair advantage. He can see what others can't. So the show can interrogate the idea of fairness. People who are already powerful will accuse Cyan of cheating. Cyan might respond, "The system has always been cheating me." Both can be true. The wealthy often start with advantages they don't acknowledge. Cyan just gets his advantage in a supernatural way, which makes it visible and therefore unfair, in a way that inherited privilege isn't perceived as unfair by those who benefit from it. That's a fascinating mirror. It can make viewers uncomfortable because it reveals how we moralize advantage depending on who has it. If the show is sharp, it won't resolve that neatly. It'll let the hypocrisy sit there. Now, I'm going to keep moving, but I want to stay with this idea of fairness because it ties directly to Cyan's moral self-image. If Cyan believes the world is unfair, he can justify almost anything as leveling the playing field. That's a seductive justification. It's also how cycles of harm continue. People who've been hurt become hurtful, and they call it justice. So the show needs to watch Cyan carefully there. It needs to show the difference between justice and revenge, between repair and domination. And if it does that through character relationships rather than speeches, it'll be much more effective. A relationship breaking because Cyan can't stop justifying his choices is more powerful than a monologue about capitalism. Another rehook, because we're getting into the kind of stuff that separates a binge from a bruise. What happens when Cyan finally gets everything he thought he wanted, and the numbers still don't stop? That's the existential core. You can buy comfort. You can buy luxury. You can buy distance from consequences for a while. You can't buy peace if the thing tormenting you is inside your head. So if the show has any psychological honesty, Cyan's greatest enemy eventually becomes his own inability to exist without calculating. He becomes addicted to prediction. And addiction narratives are always tragic because the addict believes the thing that's destroying them is the only thing keeping them alive. That's how power works too. It becomes identity. Okay, I want to pivot into a slightly more technical critique that I think is worth mentioning in a drama like this: repetition of the power visualization. If every time Cyan sees a number the show uses the same effect, the same sound, the same camera move, it will become wallpaper. The audience will stop feeling it. The show has to evolve its language. Maybe early on the numbers are bright and intrusive, almost overwhelming. Later, the numbers become subtler, because Cyan has learned to live with them. That subtlety is scarier, because it implies he's normalized the impossible. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe the numbers become more aggressive as Cyan's moral state deteriorates, reflecting his growing obsession. Either way, evolution is key. The supernatural should feel like it's alive, like it's interacting with Cyan's psyche, not like it's a static visual trick. And this ties into editing rhythm too. If the show uses the numbers as punctuation, it has to avoid over-punctuating. Otherwise it becomes noise. The best use of a gimmick is restraint. Show it just enough. Let us feel it. Then take it away at the worst possible moment so we feel its absence. Like, imagine Cyan looking at someone and not seeing a number. That would be terrifying. Not because we need law, but because uncertainty is the thing he's been trying to eradicate. The absence of data would feel like a void. That's a storytelling move that doesn't require a twist. It requires understanding character psychology. Now, I'm going to keep this rolling into the later stretch of analysis, but I want to stay grounded in what we can responsibly discuss without inventing specifics. So I'm going to talk about the kinds of payoffs that the show should aim for, rather than claiming exact plot events. A show like Countdown King sets up 3 big thematic promises. 1. Knowledge is power. 2. Power isolates. 3. Quantifying life dehumanizes. The most satisfying arcs will pay those off not with a single gotcha, but with a series of emotional consequences that accumulate. For example, if Zion becomes powerful through knowing secrets, then the payoff is not someone finds out his secret. That's the obvious route. The deeper payoff is that Zion forgets how to trust because he's trained himself to see everyone as hiding something. He might become incapable of intimacy, because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like giving up leverage. That's a real consequence. That's a cost that doesn't require a villain to defeat him. It's just Zion becoming the kind of man who can't be loved in the way he needs to be loved. And if the show goes there, it can be devastating. There's also the question of whether Zion ever uses his gift altruistically. Not as a PR move. Not as a strategy. Genuinely. And if he does it help? Or does it create unintended harm because his interference changes outcomes in ways he can't predict? That's another rich theme, the arrogance of intervention. The belief that knowing outcomes gives you the right to control them. Real life is full of that arrogance. People with power intervene in others' lives all the time and call it help. Sometimes it is help. Sometimes it's domination. Often it's both. So if Countdown King wants to be sharp, it'll show that ambiguity. Okay, let me take a breath and pull back for a second, because we've been deep in Zion's head, and I want to remind us what makes this kind of drama fun to watch, not just interesting to analyze. It's the constant tension between the glamour and the dread. It's the pleasure of watching a person outsmart a system that's been crushing him. It's the thrill of, what's the move? It's the adrenaline of escalation. It's the satisfaction of seeing someone who was ignored become impossible to ignore. Those pleasures are real. And I think it's okay to enjoy them. You don't have to watch a show like this in a permanent state of moral panic. But the best version of this show makes you enjoy it and then makes you question what you enjoyed. It turns entertainment into introspection without killing the entertainment. That's the balance. Another rehook, because there's a specific emotional payoff I want to see in a show like this, the moment Zion realizes that most powerful doesn't mean most free. If the series can land that, it becomes more than a thrill ride. It becomes a story about how power traps you with obligations, enemies, expectations, and self-created myths. Zion might be able to command rooms, but he might not be able to go for a walk without scanning faces. He might not be able to sleep without dreaming in numbers. He might not be able to love without calculating loss. That's not freedom. That's a gilded cage. So the real question is whether the show has the courage to let that cage feel suffocating, even as it looks beautiful on camera. And I think that's where I'm going to leave this thread for now and pivot into another one that I haven't fully unpacked yet, the way a drama like Countdown King can accidentally undermine its own themes if it leans too hard into coolness, because coolness is seductive, and if the show isn't careful, it can make the cage look like a throne you'd want to sit on, and the line between critique and glamour gets thin enough that you can practically see the numbers hovering over it too, telling you exactly how profitable it is to make power look desirable even when you're supposedly warning people about it, which is why the next stretch of this conversation has to be about the show's tone management, the way it frames Zion's victories, the way it frames the collateral damage, and whether the camera ever looks away in discomfort or keeps staring like it's in love with the spectacle.